Hi, everybody. I'm Steve Kalland. I'm the Executive Director of the Clean Energy Technology Center over at NC State. Some of you may remember us as the Solar Center if you're old-time Wolfpackers. We had to change our name a few years ago, but we have been around for a while at this. Before I get into this too deeply, I wanted to thank a couple of people. I certainly also wanted to thank Sushma and all the folks at DEQ that have helped to put all this together and move it forward. Jeremy in the governor's office and the folks that are doing that. Also wanted to point out two of my folks that helped pull this presentation together while I was out in Gaston County, some county, talking about how solar doesn't actually make your dog explode or your hair fall out. I do a lot of local government education work on the side. And so Isaac Panzarella and Simon Sadler in the back here helped pull this presentation together, and I really appreciate it, guys, because I would not have a lot of good things to talk about otherwise. So just real quick, so I'm going to talk a little bit about distributed energy resources and about distribution planning. These are probably two of the squishier things that you can talk about. You'll see the definition up here. This definition comes from the NERwill manual. They use small electrical generators. I went back through this and said, generators, that's not exactly right. Distributed energy resources includes a lot more than generators. And gets to some of Ryan's questions earlier about how we get energy efficiency involved in this. You see demand responses on my list. Microgrids, we just finished, of course, over at NC State in conjunction with some folks at NC Central, and thanks to Brad's group over at the Collaboratory and, of course, the legislature, the storage study. Certainly storage fits into this discussion. Electric vehicle charging infrastructure fits into this discussion. DER is a lot of different things, some of them in front of the meter, some of them behind the meter. This said 10 megawatts, I believe, was NARUC's draw the line. I've seen people say that basically, based on the way rules work in North Carolina, anything under 20 megawatts is DER. I've seen people say that basically if it's not behind the meter and on your rooftop, it's not DER. So it's a little bit amorphous as to what we're talking about, but it's generally the smaller stuff that kind of fits at the distribution level on one side of the meter or the other that helps to make the grid work better. It's like if you're old enough to remember the old BASF commercials, it's not that we don't make this stuff, we make the stuff that works better. That's what a lot of the DER is. Distribution planning. This is the process that utilities use to kind of look at the grid and figure out down at that lower level where they can make the best application of DER technologies, or at least it's supposed to be that. I think that in some cases, it's not been something that there's been a lot of attention on historically, and we're starting to see more interest in focusing on it. But basically identifying the existing system, upgrading the aging infrastructure, especially when we identify it through things like storm damage, when the power goes out or somebody runs into a transformer or a pole with a car. Accommodate new systems, all of these types of technologies that we're talking about, and build for the future as we move forward. This is usually separate from the IRP, the Integrated Resource Planning process, and the transmission planning process. And if you think about the conversation about deregulation, in most states when they talked about deregulating, they kind of broke that into three pieces. And they said, let's deregulate the wholesale generation stuff, the big guys. Let's deregulate the retail side of this because we can have a bunch of people do that. Of course, all the retail guys were buying their power from the same people, so that didn't go so well because there wasn't a lot of differentiation in services at that point, and electricity pretty much all cost the same. But everybody said poles and wires, let's leave that alone because, let's regulate that traditionally because transmission seems to make, the most sense as a regulated market. A little bit of history on that. The value of DER to the North Carolina grid. Well, now DER can be an important non-wires alternative. It can be an important wired alternative as well. It's got a lot of different applications, as I've alluded to. But, some of these things, customer-sited renewable energy production, energy storage for peak demand shaving, reducing solar clipping. Somebody was talking about the amount of solar that we might waste in this state. You can do a lot with storage. Energy resilience, and for that matter, energy what's the word that comes before resilience? I lost it in my head, but before something goes down, reliability. Thank you. God, got to quit taking all these painkillers. It's killing me. But reliability and resilience, comes from these DER resources potentially if we put them on the grid in the right places and use them in the right way. It's also grid support, ancillary services, voltage support, frequency response, all kinds of things that can be valuable that can come out of DER resources. Now, to give you a little sense of DER penetration levels, and I talked about the fact that there's kind of the big DER and the little DER, and where you draw the lines, a little bit of a fuzz here. I don't think I have a laser pointer, but if you look at this chart, this is annual solar installations by year, and the blue is the light blue, which is basically the only blue you can actually see, is the utility scale PV, and that's because about 95%, if I had to guess, and that just pulled that number out of thin air, but the largest percentage by far of the solar installed in North Carolina is utility scale solar, meaning that it's probably somewhere in the 2 megawatts or greater range. For a long time, the sweet spot was 5 megawatts. We killed the sweet spot with House Bill 589, and now I'm going out in counties having to deal with projects that are as big as 400 megawatts, which trust me, if you're a county commissioner and somebody says they want to bring 400 megawatts of a brand new technology into your county, and oh, by the way, there's people that tell them that it's going to make the cats explode or their hair fall out. It's tons of laughs talking about decommissioning of solar farms these days. This other chart is actually cumulative. So this is cumulative, whereas this is year by year. So we get all the way up to about 800 megawatts, of cumulative installed DER technologies that are net metered. So these are mostly rooftop systems, smaller systems. That's just net metered. If you took that number and you added onto it what we call buy all, sell all systems, so systems kind of outside of net metering, a lot of the NC Green Power systems went in as buy all, sell all, and these are all 10 kilowatt and smaller, or maybe they might be up to a megawatt on a commercial scale. If you add all of that together, it might double the size of that curve up to 1.4 gigawatts of solar. So what you see is the DER on rooftops, adds up to less than any one of these years since 2013 of the large-scale solar stuff. The rooftop market is really out of balance with the utility scale market, and that's what I'm trying to get across here. Policy supporting DER in North Carolina. Our last panel talked about some of this, so I'll move quickly, but this has been kind of a success story in how public policy actually works. We used to have a 35% state tax credit. It got to a point we didn't need it anymore, at least for the utility scale stuff, and that tax credit went away. I would argue that some other technologies, mostly rooftop solar, could still use that 35% tax credit, maybe storage, other technologies as well. We talked about the PURPA standard offer. Up until recently, that standard offer went up to 5 megawatts. It made projects really easy to do up to 5 megawatts. We've changed that again with House Bill 589. Now PURPA is much smaller. We've got this CPRE program. We've got the REPS, which really has almost no impact on the small systems whatsoever, but has been a driver for the larger systems. Net metering, which in North Carolina is, it's pretty good. It's not great. It's not the worst I've seen. It's not the best I've seen. But it's been under threat and of renegotiation for so long at this point that a lot of people are scared to engage in the conversation because the rules seem uncertain. And so that's something that is a problem. The other thing is that, and I hear this from my environmental friends all the time, most munis and co-ops don't offer net metering at all. They might offer buy all, sell all arrangements, but a lot of munis and co-ops just don't offer net metering, period. The property tax abatement has been a big deal for the large-scale systems. And then, of course, we have the new Duke Solar Energy Rebate, which is great if you can get one. But unfortunately, the program was structured with a lot of enthusiasm out there. And so we saw the entire program for the residential systems consumed in, somebody told me it was like 3 hours. Does that sound about right? For the first year. And I think it might have gotten like almost to 4 hours in the second year. So, the commercial systems were gone within a couple of weeks. Strangely, churches and nonprofits still have a few rebates available to them out there. So if you're like me and you're on your church's creation care committee, it's time to start talking. Other things that have been really affecting DER growth, obviously the declining cost of solar PV. I would say that this declining cost of storage after the storage study is another piece of that puzzle, and it's pretty clear that it's had a major impact. The increasing cost of electricity. It's not been flying up the way it has in other regions of the country here, but we have seen steady increases in cost of electricity in the Carolinas. And then customer interest in renewable energy, CHP, other DER technologies at all of these levels. Homeowners, You know, some homeowners want to do it for independence, reliability, bill savings, and sustainability. I can remember when the major customers for solar were militias in southern Idaho that wanted remote power and didn't want to get found by their electric bill, and pot growers in Northern California that didn't want to get found by their electric bill. It's a little more advanced than that now, but there's a bunch of those folks out there. Cities, we have a lot of these cities that are doing climate, you know, trying to basically comply with the Paris Accords directly. I think that's a driver. Companies and businesses, a lot of times it's, you know, green sustainability goals, whether it's greenwashing or it's real. It's certainly driving the markets. Some of the limiting factors in the state, low avoided cost rates, particularly based on the methodology that we use to calculate it, continue to keep the cost of avoided cost down in this state compared to other states. Lower purpose standard offer size limit, especially now with House Bill 589, we're going to see fewer purpose systems going in, and that's going to depress the market. The CPRE program is designed to replace that, but it's actually shifting most of the demand to the western part of the state where the land is a lot more expensive. There's a lot more demand for the land. It's going to make it a lot more complicated. If we're going to stay on schedule from the legislation and double the amount of solar in the state with the CPRE program, we've really got our work cut out for us to try and figure out how to make that economic. And then a lot of policy uncertainty, lack of clear energy storage policies. Go read our study. It's long, but it has a lot of information about it. Net metering uncertainty, lack of regulatory clarity for EV charging stations, which is one I think that we'll probably hear about this year. The tax credit expiration and the rebate cap both have, you know, limiting impacts. And then we don't see it as much yet, but one thing that happens in a lot of states once you start to have a residential market is homeowners associations get involved. Just real quick, different approaches and outcomes state by state. North Carolina, we've really focused on the utility scale market with our policy structure, and it has been tremendously successful. I think everybody in the room knows we're the #2 solar state in the country. There's a reason for that, and I put a lot of that at the foot of the Utility Commission, the legislature, Duke Energy, and a lot of the solar folks in this room working together to make that happen. We have been tremendously successful. South Carolina, it's a smaller market, it's a smaller state in general, but they've had a more balanced set of policies and they've got a more balanced market emerging with more rooftop. And as a matter of fact, they finally passed last Thursday in the House down there what looks like a compromise that's going to go through that's going to eliminate the net metering cap. It's going to allow direct bargaining with renewable producers for large consumers. Brad, take note. And it's going to enable third-party owned neighborhood community solar, which is another really interesting wrinkle because community solar is pretty tough in traditionally regulated markets to make work. I'm going to briefly touch on the DER interconnection process because I'm running out of time, but this is all basically commission-related stuff. It's been around since 2008 when we passed the first rules. Richard Harkrader and a number of us were involved in that conversation as well as some folks at the utilities. It was modified first passed in 2005, modified in 2008 and 2015. A lot of the issues here have really been on, you know, what can we do to try and expedite this process because it's been tremendously slow in recent years. There is a simplified process for rooftop stuff under 20 kilowatts that does work fine if you have a system going in. The 20 kilowatt to 2 megawatt fast track eligible systems, I'd say, is kind of a mixed bag. I see some nodding of heads saying, no, don't even bother. The greater than 2 megawatt process, though, is where really I think the biggest problems have lied. And really it gets to this queue issues. These charts are a little hard to follow because there's a lot of information on them, but the top chart really shows queue assignment to issuance of interconnection projects. And you can see these are like 90-day windows in each of these bars. And it takes a long time for projects to kind of get through there. Once a project gets its interconnection agreement approved, it doesn't take it very long at all to get actually installed. And this chart shows, when you get a chance to see these charts up close, it'll show you that very clearly, that the queue is really the choke point right now. What we've done to do that, well, Duke was very nice to hire a bunch of extra engineers to try and expedite the review process on their end. I think they're up to 18 or 19 engineers that are doing that. We've seen implementation of fees that actually the industry asked for to try and chase some of the folks that were basically camping out in the queue and holding places for no good reason to get those folks out of the system. Extension of the system time for review, that was a commission rule that came out recently. I'm not sure that sped things up very much, but it did get agreed to. Most recently, we've seen some priority for swine waste projects. It came out of, I believe, out of House Bill 589, and that was an effort to try and meet that part of the reps. And then current open docket changes. There's a current docket open to look at new changes, and that's going to be tons of laughs based on at least the last couple of working groups that they've held. Let's see, what else do I want to touch on here in my limited time left? Obviously, the grid is changing. Net additions to DER are growing faster than centralized generation. The CPRE requirements are out there and still being discussed a little bit. There's some question in my mind about exactly what happens to projects under PURPA if you don't win a CPRE bid. And so I think that's going to be a little bit of a question that needs to get sorted out. What we're seeing is Duke is proposed to address some of these issues through their new grid improvement plan proposal. A lot of those are very relevant to DER, smart meter installation, the EV pilot program, integrated system operations planning, which is kind of like distribution planning on steroids. It brings together some of the distribution planning discussion along with some of the transmission and IRP and integrated resource planning conversations. Not fully, but it's probably a step in the right direction of looking more holistically at this stuff. Obviously, a lot of this is, and everything in that proposal is still ongoing at the commission. I'm at time, so I'll hit 2 more quick slides if I can. Data access rules. One of the biggest things that DER customers of all stripes need is more transparency to data. And we have a real problem with trying to get that transparency. We have transparency for customers of the utilities. They can ask for their information and the utilities will release it, but there's nothing that requires it to be released to third parties. And if you're developing new technology, you need access to some sort of data at some sort of level in order to be able to design products that are going to have an impact in the marketplace. We are behind much of the country in developing data transparency rules in this state, although I will say that we are on track right now thanks to several dockets, and I think that's actually sub 157, not 147. But there is a docket that has basically led to the new docket 161, where we're going to be starting to talk about the green button download program, which comes out of a DOE program to try and increase transparency of data. So a few final key observations. DER is going to continue to expand in North Carolina and across the U.S. no matter what. It's a given. The technologies are out there. There's no genie going back in the bottle. It could provide a more competitive energy market, which helps to keep costs down. It could increase reliability, resilience, and grid balancing. It could complicate everybody's life tremendously, especially if you happen to be a grid operator, which would probably be the case. But it could actually simplify their lives if we figure out how to do it right. It can reduce carbon intensity of electricity, which is, I guess, in the end, what all of this is about. And so, with that said, that's my best take in 16 and a half minutes at trying to define DER and distribution planning for you.
Great. Well, thanks for that overview of, in your words, the small stuff. And now we're going to hear from Brad from UNC about the large stuff. As a reminder, you have sticky notes and Sharpie pens on your table to capture your questions for our presenters to help you remember them. And also, if we don't have time to get to them, we'll capture them on flip charts in the back.
Great. Thank you very much for that. It's always tough to follow Steve. I feel like it's a little bit of a comedy act, and it's much more informative than anything I have to say. So it's between the two things, it's very hard. I do want to thank the staff at DEQ for organizing this event and for bringing somebody like me here to talk today. As I looked over the list, I went, wait a minute, I'm not an academic, even though I'm from a university, and I don't run an institute, even though I kind of run an institute, which I'll explain to you in a second. But I'm really an operator. You know, a lot of familiar faces out here, but some of you don't know me. So I'm Brad Ives. I wear 3 hats at UNC. My day job is I'm Associate Vice Chancellor for Campus Enterprises. I have 4 divisions in that, and one of those is all of our utilities. So I have responsibility for what happens at campus. And I'm going to talk a lot about that to start out with. The second thing I do is I'm the Chief Sustainability Officer. So I'm the person there who's got to answer for what we do environmentally. And that's really in conflict with also running the energy assets because we have a coal-fired cogeneration plant. And then the third hat I wear, which Steve graciously referred to, is thanks to the legislature's action 2 years ago, or 3 years ago now, I'm the Executive Director of the North Carolina Policy Collaboratory. And in that capacity, we were overseeing the storage study that NC State and NC Central did. If you haven't read a copy of that yet, get it. It is one of the best studies ever done on storage. There's a lot of information in there that a crowd like this, if you haven't seen it, it's going to be eye-opening for you. Like all the things I'm about to talk about, nothing is a perfect answer. What this group is tasked with and what the governor has tasked everyone with is incredibly hard. And I think as I talk a little bit today, I'm going to unfortunately sort of spread some of that wide open to you as a consumer and tell you what others are seeing, but hopefully finish up with some opportunities where we can work together to change policy, to look at opportunities we've got here in North Carolina. So with that, just to talk some about the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, we run a large microgrid. We're a customer of Duke Energy Carolinas. We generate some of our own electricity through cogeneration, but our overall load, the highest peak load we've had is in the low 90 megawatt range. Our typical load is in the 80 megawatt range. We can generate up to 32 megawatts ourselves out of our cogeneration plant, but we're actually steam driven. We use steam for building heating, hot water, and process heat at our hospital and our laboratories. We've got laboratories that contain things like Ebola and Zika virus, so we have to have negative pressure. These are things that can never go down. Same thing with our hospital. We're a level 1 trauma center, so again, reliability is really, really key to us. At the same time, we've gone out with very ambitious environmental goals. We've got something we call the 3 zeros that we're trying to achieve. We want to be greenhouse gas neutral, have zero waste to landfills, and be water neutral. The good news is we've done a lot on the water side, and we're actually water neutral already. Zero waste to landfill, I think I don't have to tell all of you here, is a daunting goal that I hope that my children or grandchildren can actually achieve. We'd like to get down to something more on the order of 20% of our waste as a more foreseeable goal. Greenhouse gases, this is the one that obviously we're focused on today. And it's interesting to look at a campus like ours, and I think that you're going to find that we actually function like a lot of industrial sites. Our scope 1 emissions, so our direct emissions, are about 50% of our overall emissions. Those primarily come from our cogeneration plant. It burns currently 75% coal, 25% natural gas. We have a backup natural gas-fired plant that we use for steam production. Our scope 2 emissions, which basically come from purchasing power from Duke Energy, are 23% of our overall emissions. The other scopes, which I'm not going to talk much about today, but I want to get these numbers out to you so that as you think of state policy, you keep them in mind. Air travel for us is 14% of our overall emissions. Food, so total, from putting the seed and tilling the ground to put the seed in the ground before you put the fertilizer on it, all the way to hauling what's left to the landfill, is roughly 7% of our emissions. Commuting, which I think most people would expect to be higher, is around 5% of our emissions. So that's the sum total of all of our emissions. Well, with that, what are the options that somebody like me has? What are we doing today? Well, our options are really limited, and that led me to get heavily involved in the Green Source Rider program in House Bill 589, and I'll talk some more about that in a minute. But when you look at campus, I was quoted in our campus paper today as saying that kids come to me every year and say, why don't we put solar on top of all the buildings? That'll solve all of our problems. Well, unfortunately, they didn't print the rest of the quote, which was, we did the math on that. Solar would supply between 0.6 and 0.75% of our power load, not our overall energy usage. So just electricity, if we put solar on every rooftop that looks reasonable to put solar on. So on-site power generation is a tough one for us with renewables. We've got a 530-acre central campus. If you've been over to our campus, it's really stuffed with buildings. The green space that surrounds us has trees. We like the trees. We want to keep them standing there, so we're not going to cut them down to put in something else. So what do we have? Well, we've got the cogen plant, and in 2010, we came out and announced that we would get off of coal by 2020. I wasn't working there then. I've only been there the last 3.5 years. The plan for that was to go with torrefied biomass. Ironically, I was running a torrefied biomass company in 2010. I knew at that time that that technology was not going to get there at a price point that UNC could afford, even if the technology did get there. And unfortunately, the technology has not gotten there. So bringing large-scale biomass into our site doesn't work really well. Smaller colleges, especially in the Northeast, a lot of them have been able to go to wood pellets, basically to boil water. Some industrial users in North Carolina have done the same thing. If you've got a boiler, wood pellets has been a decent option. Obviously, there are environmental concerns about that. But that is something to keep in mind when we're thinking about renewables, that solar isn't going to work for everything. And the reason solar is not going to work for everything is, like I said, with the labs in a hospital, I've got to have fuel in the ground. You know, a lot of you probably remember the 2003 blackout. I was actually in New York City when the power went out, working with Energy Technology Venture Capital Fund that I had helped get started. I looked out the window, saw that the power had gone out, and realized that we had a significant problem. We can have that type of problem here, and when you run an organization like ours that's got, you know, these biocontainment labs, you've got the hospital, you have to think about that. So if we are, you know, how do we get energy to our campus? We get it there across power lines, we get it there in a natural gas pipeline, we bring it in through rail cars, we can bring it in on trucks. But if you're totally dependent on renewables, those are going to come mainly from off-site via your power lines. So how do you build redundancy? We've been looking at storage. Storage has got a long way to go to be able to carry a load of our size. So that's not really an option. It means that we're going to have to keep some sort of liquid fuel or solid fuel on the ground at our site. And to date, unfortunately, that's been coal. The good news is we are looking at we're about to begin construction of a modification of our boilers that will take us to 50% natural gas. This modification also will give us the ability, we think, to go 50% liquid fuel. And that 50% liquid fuel, we're looking at biofuel solutions. So that's the type of thing that a customer like us can look at with the infrastructure that we've got. We do have some land in a second grid we have. If you know the Chapel Hill area, it's where the Horace Williams Airport used to be. That's a separate about 1.5 megawatt grid that we have. We're about to start construction on a 0.5 megawatt of power there and a 0.5 megawatt of battery storage. So in looking at that, we're going with experimenting with that to see how it's going to work, but we don't have that much more land, and that's about as much as we can do there. So I wanted to talk about House Bill 589. A lot of us spent a ton of time on that. I went in to narrowly negotiate the green source rider and the storage provision. Storage provision worked, we got the money. NC State did this great work. The green source rider, we've kind of come up empty on that. And it's an issue over the pricing. We went in there, Google and Apple and Facebook and Walmart teamed up with UNC Chapel Hill to try and make something work. I worked in very good faith with Duke Energy. I think we ended up with a very honest dispute about pricing. I tried to negotiate that separately. Then we went to the Utilities Commission, and we've ended up with something that we don't think works. Walmart has entered into a settlement to use incremental hourly pricing, which we believe will work for them. It will work for other large companies that have exposure to different markets, but really isn't going to be practical for people in the state. So I think we're going to have to go back and look at that. The other option that the Utilities Commission approved was it basically gives you 5 years of pricing stability. So using the 5-year avoided cost rate, but after 5 years, you're going to have to reset your bill credit mechanism. And for somebody who's a steward of taxpayer money, tuition money, fees from students, we can't take that kind of chance. And I don't think, as we look at lowering emissions across the state can't take that kind of chance that we won't know what we're going to be paying for power in 5 years. So we've got to find a solution for that. So in the remaining time, I want to talk a little bit about, so what are the positives? Where should we really be looking? One of the things that UNC has done to lower its emissions is efficiency. And it's not the typical efficiency of building efficiency. We've done that. We've got a lot more to do, replacing LEDs, better HVAC handling systems. But our biggest pickup came from our steam distribution network. We rebuilt significant parts of that, and between that and some building efficiencies, we have gained a 17% lowering of our overall emissions. That lever pool is almost done, so now we're looking for, what else can we do? Uh, One other thing that I know that Appalachian State spent a lot of time looking at, and I looked at this when I was overseeing the North Carolina Zoo, is on-site solar and how to bring in efficiency of financing of that. The project that we're doing at the Horace Williams Airport, we're just paying cash for it. There's no advantage, no tax credits, nothing like that in it, no grant money. And it's unfortunate. I mean, we're lucky that we can afford to do it as an experiment, but if we're going to have more meaningful projects, what Appalachian ran into was a ground lease problem in state law. You want to be able to do a ground lease so you can have the ownership structure that's going to be able to monetize tax credits. So how do we do that? I think that's something that this group can come up with a proposal on. I think we also need to look at demand response. That's another area of efficiency. At UNC, we have a 5 million gallon chilled water storage tank, which allows us to take all of our chillers offline for between 2 to 4 hours. The chillers are the largest part of our electric load. So this is something that we actually only have limited use of that asset. Is there a better way to have a pricing mechanism to cause us to use that more often? Can we use that for grid stabilization, for frequency regulation, things like that? I think we can. And frankly, I think we could build a second chilled water storage tank and be able to take all of our chillers offline for a whole day if we had a financing method to deal with that. So please think about ideas like that. I also think that we need some more incentives and programs around fleet electrification, bus electrification. There's some good federal money coming into this, but it's not enough yet. We're going to need a lot more help. The Chapel Hill transit system, we finance almost 60% of that. And we're just about to get our first 2 electric buses. We'd love to be much farther along on that, so we're looking for solutions there. And then finally, what I would call hyper-efficient buildings. LEED has been good, but having worked in this building and the accompanying building, which were, highly, I believe were LEED gold buildings, we need to look at LEED and pick the parts of LEED that make real sense and not game the points through bike racks and electric car parking spaces. Let's focus more on the energy footprint. We're building net zero schools in the state. We should be building net zero buildings at state universities, at parks, at other state DMV sites. Let's think about ways to do that, to have incredibly low load buildings, and come up with ways that we find to maximize everything that we do. When we spend $1 of state money, that's very precious money. It's come from hardworking families. And how do we put that dollar into the project that's going to feed the most money back to the state through efficiency? And it's something that at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill is just a daunting challenge for us. Like many of you, I'm constantly squeezed between my environmental community on one hand, my energy suppliers on the other hand. And I think that the state can play such a valuable role in fixing all of this for all of us. So the task that we have here over the next couple of months is really, really important. And I hope that some of these ideas I'm throwing out can start a good dialogue. So thank you very much.
Great, thanks both. I think we have time for a few questions for these last 2 speakers. And I'll alternate back and forth across the room.
All right, I'll kick it off for these 2. I'm Daniel Brookshire with NCSCA. I think every speaker has mentioned avoided cost one way or the other. I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. Maybe this is for Steve. Talk to me about what is it? What goes into it? Talk about avoided capacity, avoid generation. What does North Carolina peg it to? That's a lot, but but why is it? And what are other states doing that we could learn from?
There are lots of methodologies. There are lots of different methodologies that are used around the country. Okay, there we go. There's lots of different methodologies that are used around the country for calculating avoided cost. We have a particular one that we use here in North Carolina. It's pretty commonly used throughout the Southeast. The reality is that if I fully answered that question, everybody here would either pass out or die of old age. But there is a lot of conversation that could be had about, reform to that process, about what should be in that process, about what should be out of that process, and for God's sake, how could we bring more transparency to that process? I think that's probably the biggest issue, is that it's really, really hard if you're not, signed on to a non-disclosure agreement to see what's going on in that process. It's hard enough when things at the commission, and this is not to take anything away from my friends at the commission or the public staff, when you're trained in this stuff to understand what's going on. But, for those of us that are kind of outside stakeholders trying to figure it all out, lack of transparency, the level of complexity, it makes it tough. And so if I was going to be getting into a conversation about that, that's probably where I would want to leave the level of this conversation, at least, is, there needs to be increased number of stakeholders participating in that process, and there needs to be increased levels of transparency so that those stakeholders understand what they're doing. Oh, and can I make a quick plug real quick? 3 great educational opportunities coming up in the next 2 months, just to make sure everybody's aware. UNC on Thursday and Friday this week is hosting the UNC Clean Tech Summit. There's going to be some great sessions there. I happen to be moderating one. So if you're like my comedy act, come on out. But
It's going to be a boring session.
yeah, I'm sure. But that's a great opportunity. I know Emmett Owen back in the back here, Research Triangle Clean Tech Cluster hosting the GTM Grid Edge East. Is that the correct title? End of the month. So if you're interested in the GTM conference, that's going to be in Durham at the end of the month. And then, of course, the State Energy Conference at the McKimmon Center in, I guess, end of April, beginning of May. So please try to attend those events. There'll be lots of information on all of these topics.
And Steve left out the Appalachian State Mid-Year Energy Conference, which is this Thursday at UNC Greensboro as well.
Correct.
Great. And do we have 1 or 2 more questions?
Tim Gasper with Siemens Industry. One question, Brad, for you is the executive order, which is why we're all here, mandates agencies only. I think it suggests that others align their goals and policies, but it's not a mandate. Has UNC Chapel Hill and the UNC system in general, if you know, aligned their goals for energy savings with the executive order?
Far more complicated answer than you would expect. I think that at Chapel Hill, we were already aligned. Well, first of all, most colleges and universities in America have signed on to the American College and University President's Climate Commitment and did that in the kind of 2007 through, I think, 2010 range. As part of that, all of the signatories they've agreed to be greenhouse gas neutral by 2050. So you had that already driving everybody's behavior. With us, with our 3 zeros, I mean, we haven't come out and set a date of greenhouse gas neutrality yet. Part of it is I'm having been hired to unwind our statement that we were going to be off of coal by 2020 without a plan. I'm very loath to come out with a date until I've got a technology or multiple technologies. I've got a financing plan and all of that. We'll beat the hell out of 2050. I don't know exactly what that's going to be. I also, again, without having specific announced goals, can tell you that we look to do better than the 40% overall reduction. As far as the UNC system, it's a difficult time right now in governance of the UNC system, and we don't have a cohesive voice on that yet. I think when you go to the individual institutions and when I talk to all of them, they're definitely bought in and want to achieve it, but we're looking really for overall policy, and it's just not something that we currently have, unfortunately.